I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as Moscow resumes its bombardments against Ukraine, we discuss reports that it is dawning on the Trump administration a swift ceasefire deal is not going to happen without action against the Russian economy. Then we return to that very subject and ask just how much leverage the White House has on sanctions.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
It's the worst carnage that this world has seen since World War II.
Absolutely fascinating.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Wednesday, the 2nd of April, 3 years and 38 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by our Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls, and Senior Writer at Bloomberg and sanctions expert, Stephanie Baker. But first, over to Dom for the latest battlefield developments.
Let's start in Kherson. Ukraine's Foreign Minister Andrei Sybiha and Kherson Oblast Military Administration Head Alexander Prokudin said yesterday that Russian forces shelled energy infrastructure in Kherson city yesterday morning, leaving at least 45,000 Kherson residents without electricity. Mr. Sybiha said Russian forces have violated the energy infrastructure ceasefire several times recently. Now, I know you covered that news yesterday, but I just wanted to add a comment to it. I think it's actually quite unhelpful that Mr. Sybiha makes these comments, as there's no such ceasefire with agreed terms. It hasn't been signed up to by Russia and Ukraine. And by making these claims, Mr. Sybiha, I think, is giving de facto permission for Russia to criticise Ukraine on any strikes they conduct into Russia and elsewhere, according to an agenda that Moscow wants to set, because there is no common agreed position that we can point to, or anyone can point to say one side or the other has violated the ceasefire. Anyway, where else? Geolocated footage from yesterday shows Russian forces have recently advanced to the northwest of Novolyubivka. That's just to the northeast of Liman in Luhansk Oblast. It's likely that they've seized the village there. This is about 30 k's northeast of Liman, just on the Luhansk side of the border with Donetsk Oblast. Now, the Institute for the Study of War, the US-based think tank, say Russian forces got across the Zerabets River. That's just to the east of the village. It runs north-south in the area. They got across the river onto the West Bank in early January this year and have slowly tried to expand the bridgehead over the last 3 months. Russian mill bloggers and the Ukrainian military observer Konstantin Mashevitz have said the elements from Russian 144th and 3rd Motorized Rifle Divisions have made that move across the river and tried to push on from there. Now, the ISW says that Russian forces appear to be leveraging a significant manpower advantage, i.e. they've got many more fighters relative to the ones that Ukraine has there, to make advances in the area, and they may try to seize the remaining 1% of Luhansk Oblast that's under Ukrainian control. So that's about 260-odd square kilometres. That, we know, is a long-standing, well, it's more than a desire. It simply has to happen for Putin. He's claimed that they've got the whole of the Oblast, so he has to take Luhansk. That's clearly what they're trying to do there. OK, where else? Last night, Russian forces conducted an airstrike on the port of Kherson in southern Ukraine. The maritime risk management firm Ombre Intelligence say 3 missiles hit a building in the Kherson shipyard, and reportedly multiple Ukrainian personnel were killed and equipment was destroyed. Now, the footage that Ombre are referring to did not show any vessels moored in the vicinity of the explosions. But that and other Russian strikes across Ukraine killed at least 3 yesterday, injured about 18. 74 drones were fired by Russia, with damage reported in the Kharkiv, Donetsk and Odessa oblasts. Those stats come from the Air Force. 15 drones alone fired into Kyiv city. OK, the next one for me, the Unmanned Systems Forces, that's the branch of Ukraine's armed forces that oversees the whole of Ukraine's drone fleet, have begun recruiting members for a new women's unit called the Harpies. They said this in a statement this morning. Now, the Harpies also include male personnel, but, quote, the role of pilots who deliver the final blows will be performed exclusively by women. That's what the unit said on Telegram this morning. Now, the branch is offering 75 days of training across all the drones that they fly, the FPV drones, the heavy bombers, the fixed wings, and also the associated ground systems. So their statement went on, the Harpies are a community of women who seek to take revenge on Russia and protect their children, families and the state using unmanned systems. The Kyiv Independent says there are 68,000 women in Ukraine's armed forces, including 48,000 uniformed military personnel and 5,000 fighters deployed at the front lines. They take those stats from Ukraine's defence ministry last year. And just last one for me, Francis. The online news site Avon Legendaire says that the UK may be about to transfer 10 Puma transport helicopters to Ukraine. So the Pumas were decommissioned in March. They're pretty old helicopters, but they're still reliable. It'd be good if they are transferred. Of course, it's always the logistic tail, the maintenance, all the other associated bits and pieces that, well, with any piece of military equipment, but especially anything that flies, sinks or goes under the water. That's the real difficulty. So if they can keep these serviced and maintained and fit to fly, then that will be a good addition to Ukraine's aviation forces. And that's us up to date, Francis.
Thanks, Dom, and we'll hear exactly where you are in a moment. I'll start with two interesting stories published today by Reuters. The first reports that senior Trump administration officials believe the US will be unable to secure a Ukraine peace deal in the next few months and are drawing up new plans, therefore, to pressure both Kyiv and Moscow, according to two US officials familiar with the matter. So it's not just us, everyone. Unless something drastic happens, we are simply not on a trajectory for a meaningful ceasefire or peace deal to be signed in short order, despite all of Trump's pledges to end the war in 24 hours or in his first weeks of office. Reuters goes on to say that it is not clear what specific plans the administration may have to pressure Moscow, but one senior US official said the White House is continuing to look at additional tariff and sanctions measures it can levy on the country. More on that later. The other interesting story is that US officials have reportedly told European allies, if we can refer to them as such anymore, they want them to buy American-made arms amid recent moves by the EU to limit US manufacturers' participation in weapons tenders. So in essence, the administration is trying to have its cake and eat it too, seeking Europe to decouple from US defence, but not in a manner which would mean a major financial loss for America. But given the events of recent weeks, there will be huge reluctance in Europe to purchase weapons which the US might still have some control over in the long term, whether kill switches, patches, or ceasing the replacing of vital components. As Jack Watling of the Royal United Services Institute wrote in that Foreign Affairs piece we discussed last week, if the US tries to force a process of European rearmament by compelling European countries to buy more US-made weapons, it will not be successful because of distrust. Nonetheless, certain weapon systems are only available, of course, from the US, and some will wonder whether there might still be a pathway for Europe to buy weapons from the US to give to Ukraine or to fill their own stockpiles. But the question remains now whether any deal signed can be trusted with this White House. That is why trust matters in politics. That's why alliances matter. So expect this to rumble on, but if the US does want Europe to still buy American, then that will give European countries some leverage over the White House in upcoming discussions. Now, speaking of Europe, countries participating in the so-called Coalition of the Willing are set to meet in Ukraine on the 4th. President Zelensky said yesterday, "There will be a meeting of our military teams among several countries," he said. "A narrow circle of countries, those who will be ready to deploy a contingent in one form or another." He said the visit will be the first in-depth meeting of that coalition. Now, we also learned yesterday that Kyiv has received the text of the US's expanded deal on minerals resources and carried out the first round of consultations with its US partners. Foreign Minister Sybiha said that Kyiv was ready to sign the previously developed framework agreement. Now we've received a proposal for development and a new text. Ukraine is still determined to conclude a document that would meet the interests of both countries. Now, when he references the previously developed framework, I think he means the table deal, which was in between that initial Versailles-style deal we spoke about, and the latest one, which we talked about at the end of last week, which was described by one individual as neo-colonialist. So there is a middle deal, which Kyiv is saying it was happy to sign, and there are two others that it is unhappy to sign, including the latest one. That's my reading of it. Now, we really need separate titles for each draft, but it just speaks to a chaotic picture at the moment. Kyiv doesn't know where it stands with the US, Europe doesn't know where it stands with the US, and neither does China. The Economist has published an interesting article which reflects on this question, and as it writes, one Chinese camp fears that for China, Trump 2.0 will be a repeat of the first. This group is sure that China and America are locked in a generational struggle. There is another camp, though, that sees Washington as a city in the grip of a revolution. This group believes that America first may soon mean America alone, as Trump pulls down the pillars of the global trading system and betrays allies in Asia as well as in Europe. In today's Beijing, it is striking to hear scholars and retired party officials compare the second Trump term to the Cultural Revolution of 1966 to 76, in which they themselves suffered terribly. In effect, they are accusing Trump of wrecking a global order that benefits everyone, including China and America. So an interesting piece in The Economist, and yet it says at the end, it quoting one frequent member of Chinese delegations to Washington, "Look at the way the Ukraine war is ending. Taiwan should know very clearly that it can't count on US military support in the Taiwan Strait." Now that is why many would argue one cannot separate Ukraine and Taiwan as issues. It's why Taiwanese experts often say the biggest thing the US can do for Taiwan is to support Kyiv. Now, for more on evolving attitudes in Asia and the Pacific, do check out, as ever, our sister podcast, Battle Lines, which focuses on wider global issues in our brave new world. Monday's episode focuses on Australia's responses to the recent Chinese flotilla. Now, of course, another realm of deep interconnectedness where subjects resist isolation is economics, which is why it's great to be joined now by Stephanie Baker again, senior writer at Bloomberg and author of Punishing Putin, Inside the Global Economic War to Bring Down Russia. She's been sharing a stage with Dom in a city somewhere near the Cotswolds. Stephanie, it's been several weeks since we've had you on, and it looks like a lot has changed in the economic realm. One of the major questions is whether Trump will seek to economically threaten Russia, as I was describing earlier on, and what impact that could have. We learned today that a bipartisan bill was introduced in the Senate, led by Republican Lindsey Graham and Democrat Richard Blumenthal, aimed at imposing sanctions on Russia if the Kremlin undermines peace efforts. It's backed by 50 senators, and among the proposed punishments are 500% tariffs on imports from countries that purchase Russian energy. Should we be taking this seriously?
Absolutely. I think this is the first time that such a large group of Republican senators have come together to threaten what would be some of the harshest sanctions on Russian oil that we've seen proposed yet. This is an unconventional approach. It goes off of the proposal, the executive order that Trump signed in last week to impose secondary tariffs on countries that buy oil from Venezuela. So this is in a similar vein, that this would impose tariffs on countries that buy Russian oil, gas, or uranium at a rate of 500% on any of their exports to the United States. Now, this would shift the burden of enforcement on third parties. It's a sort of twist on secondary sanctions, whereby the U.S. would impose sanctions on individuals, entities, and countries that do business with sanctioned entities. And it is a real threat, and it could potentially take a significant chunk of Russian oil off the market because those 500% tariffs would be incredibly high. It does look like they've got quite a bit of support for it. There's no vote scheduled for it, but Trump has just thrown his weight behind this proposal that if Putin doesn't come to the negotiating table, he will hit them hard with sanctions on Russian oil.
Now, Stephanie, we're here in the lovely grounds of Exeter College in Oxford. We've been at the Oxford Literary Festival this morning. Thank you so much for joining us. So Donald Trump says today is Liberation Day. If the proposed tariffs go through, as we expect later on today, I think it's 4 p.m. East Coast time, which would be 9 p.m. London time. But if the tariffs go through as we expect, one result could be the collapse in the oil price, and that may damage Russia's economy and possibly thereby help Ukraine. How likely is that?
Well, if the tariffs do go ahead, most economists believe a global trade war would at some point trigger a global recession, which of course would impact oil prices. A significant economic slowdown globally would affect the demand for oil and therefore the price, and that would hit Russia hard. As it is, I think the average price that Russia was getting, at least from its Baltic seaport, was $62 a barrel, which was just above the price cap of $60. If that drops considerably, say another $10 a barrel, Russia will have to go back and raid further its national well-being fund, the liquid portion of which it has burned through about 2/3 of. It's hard to gauge exactly how quickly it would push Russia into a corner economically. It really depends on how far the price goes down. But yes, that would certainly put pressure on the Russian economy and finances and Putin's abilities to sustain the war.
Thank you. Now, looking a little bit wider, time to mark a few scorecards, if you will. So sanctions overall, the sanctions on Russia, success or failure? Have they maintained the aim that they set out with, or has the focus shifted at all? So can you just take us under the bonnet of the Russian economy in spring 2025?
Right. Well, I think initially, after the full-scale invasion in 2022, there were overly optimistic predictions that the Russian economy would collapse because of the unprecedented actions that were taken. And then the policy seemed to shift to, well, we may not be able to change Putin's calculus. He doesn't seem to care too much about the overall health of the Russian economy. Can we bleed him of the resources to sustain and finance the war? I think that the G7 rolled out sanctions too slowly. Prime example would be Biden's rollout of the oil sanctions in January, 10 days before he left the White House. Those were the harshest sanctions on Russian oil yet, including 180 vessels and 2 significant oil producers in Russia. And that was, in many people's minds, too little too late. And that had they rolled those out earlier, that Ukraine would be in a stronger position and Russia would be in a weaker position. So I give the sanctions campaign against Russia a 6 in terms of scope and aim, and maybe a 4 in terms of enforcement. I think they could be doing a lot more for enforcement. I think that is a real challenge ahead. Is a lot of people are assuming with Trump in office that the U.S. sanctions are not going to be enforced. Enforcement was weak to begin with, but you can see this by the behavior of tankers, sanctioned tankers in the waters now. I think they're feeling a bit emboldened to call at ports in China and India in a way that they were reluctant to do just a few weeks prior.
Interesting stuff. Now, one more for me. I know Francis has a question, but you lived and worked in Russia during the, what should we call it, exciting, optimistic, the chaotic upheaval of the 1990s. You lived in Moscow. What went wrong? Did we think that democracy would just logically flow from a new market-orientated economy? And what happened, or more importantly, perhaps didn't happen, to those democratic institutions in Russia in the 1990s?
Yeah, the 1990s was an incredibly chaotic period. There was a lot that went wrong. I was there in covering privatization at the tail end of the so-called loans for shares privatization that created the crop of oligarchs that are now widely under sanction. And I think there was an underestimation of how damaging that would be, and that it was, as many people referred to it, Russia's original sin, and that corruption was embedding in Russia's nascent market economy and democratic institutions. And so I think there was a blindness by Western politicians who allowed this to go through. I think they did have some objections, but at the same time, I don't think that they were willing to step up to the plate to provide the sort of substantial financial aid to post-Soviet Russia that was really required given the scale of the economic collapse that followed the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I think there was just a hope during that period that Russia would turn the corner and work through some of these problems, that those were bumps in the road, but they turned out to be the seeds, I think, of the current problems that we're seeing now.
Thanks, Stephanie, for your reflections. It's really interesting. Just one question I have is, we were speaking a moment ago about this proposal for very extreme tariffs on Russia and other countries who might be buying energy from Russia. But I wonder whether the Trump administration will always have this kind of economic leverage or political capital, if you see what I mean. Because at the moment, of course, the administration is still new, but there are signs that this trade war and all of the chaos that's been sown in recent weeks will have detrimental effects on the Trump administration and its power and freedom for maneuver. If there are to be very, very strict economic sanctions on Russia, is the time, in a sense, very limited in which that is actually feasibly possible before something maybe changes and the freedom for maneuver that Trump's team might have diminishes?
Well, you're right that Trump is talking about imposing sweeping sanctions on U.S. allies, Europe in particular, in the UK, and obviously Canada, at the same time as if he pushes ahead with this potential 500% tariff on other countries that buy Russian oil, gas, and uranium, he'd be relying on them to cooperate on this. And there is a lack of coordination, it appears. I think there's political appetite in Europe to hit Russian oil hard. That would be welcome pivot by Europe if Trump does change tack and stop echoing Kremlin talking points and start hitting Russia with tougher sanctions to extract concessions at the negotiating table. But it's being done in a very unilateral way. And it's hard to see how the mix of tariffs on Europe are going to mix with Trump's response to get everyone else to stop buying Russian oil potentially overnight. But I don't see a lot of coordination with Europe on this.
Well, thank you very much, Stephanie, for your time today. I know you've got to dash off now, but I highly recommend to listeners that they check out your book, Punishing Putin, which we'll link to in the show notes. It's a really, really pivotal read for understanding the approach that was adopted on the sanctions question by Europe and indeed the United States. Let's go to our final thoughts now. Dom, it's appropriate that you're in Exeter College. I think I'm right in saying that that's a college associated with J.R.R. Tolkien. Of course, David was a huge fan of Tolkien, so he would have loved that. But where do you want to leave our listeners? What are your reflections out of Oxford?
Well, thanks, Francis. So it was a lovely event this morning, the talk in the Sheldonian Theatre, a theatre more used to mortar boards than mortar rounds, but apparently that was what we had to deal with today. So I was speaking to Stephanie Baker, that you've just heard from, also Mark Galliotti and Keir Giles. And it was very clear from the audience, and luckily we had no snoozers and no walkers, so they all stayed till the end. But it was very clear that people are nervous. People are very nervous at the moment, not only with the subject of the talk was the Russian threat, when did it get so big and what can we do about it, basically. And they were very nervous, but also the upheaval from the West, not only the impact of Donald Trump, but also the very great changing security dynamic in Europe. With the further north and the further east you go, the more clear-eyed the threat is and the greater the commitment to do something about it. But just the upheaval at the moment, people are very nervous. And I underline for me that there's no doubt at all the post-Cold War period, I think, finished with the inauguration of Donald Trump for his second term, not just because of Trump. He doesn't get to grab all the headlines, but just because of everything else that's happening in the world now. This is a very different world to what it was a few years ago, maybe a few months ago. The security dynamic has totally changed. The architecture in Europe and in NATO has fundamentally changed. And I don't think that all of Europe and all the NATO allies are responding, not in terms of money or policy or what have you, but perhaps intellectually. I don't know if everyone's grasped it. I think some people are still thinking, well, in 4 years' time, Donald Trump will be out of power and the Ukraine war will have finished and we can go back to what we were. I don't think that world exists anymore. And I'm a bit nervous as well that there's not the intellectual horsepower being expended at the moment to think, well, what is going to come next and how do we craft it? And if we come up with a vision how do we then join the dots from where we are now to where we want to be in a few years' time? So there was a lot of nerves going around the audience this morning in the questions, and I think that speaks volumes for where we are right now in spring 2025. But let's see what happens later, Liberation Day, and if all these tariffs lead to a global trade war, which will have undoubted knock-on implications for the security field.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from Ukraine, please subscribe to The Telegraph at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciated this podcast, please follow Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review as it helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist in your language. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. We're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Thank you, and best wishes from London.